G'day viewers, my name's Oren Thomas, and in this session I'm going to be going through Windows Server Hybrid for Beginners. If you want to find out all my details, just go to aka.ms/Oren. Okay, let's start with the big question. What is hybrid? It's a complicated question because there's not an easy answer. So the one I've come up with is it's a continuum. Marty, what's a continuum? Well, let's think about it this way. You can be all on-prem or you can be all in the cloud. And when I'm thinking about, or when you're thinking about hybrid, what you've got to realize is it's as much or as little cloud as is right for your, not mine, not theirs, not his, not hers, organization. So you figure out what is right for you. And this is how I want you to think about hybrid. Hybrid is what we are considering a steady state, in that when people have talked about cloud in the past, what they've done is they've said, oh, cloud hybrid's only a transitional state. That at the moment you're all on-prem, and then you're going to take this great journey across the ocean and you're going to end up at the cloud. But the reality is that most organizations are going to have their on-premises resources for quite some time, maybe forever. But they're also going to have some resources in the cloud. And hybrid is about finding that place on that path where your organization is having its needs met. It's having its problems solved. So what I want to talk about just for a moment, and the thing that sort of forms the spine of this whole talk, is the newly announced Windows Server Hybrid Administrator Associate Certification. So this session is Introduction to Windows Server Hybrid, and what I'm going to be talking about is some Windows Server Hybrid technologies. But I'm also going to be making reference to how these technologies are relevant to certain parts of this newly announced certification and the two exams that make up this certification. So there's two exams, as I just said. This first exam, AZ 800, deals with all of your core Windows Server technologies and how they interact with a hybrid cloud. So we start with identity, we move into management, we move into managing virtual machines or compute. We talk about managing on-premises and hybrid networking infrastructure, and then we look at managing storage and file services. In the second exam, which builds on the first, we move from those core technologies through to more advanced things. And the things that we're dealing with in the advanced SKU is that we're looking at how you handle security in a hybrid environment, how you manage high availability in a hybrid environment, how you implement disaster recovery in a hybrid environment, how you migrate workloads if you do decide, well, I've got that on-prem thing right now, and what I want to do is I want to move that to the cloud. Well, how you migrate. And then importantly, how do you think about monitoring and troubleshooting your Windows Server hybrid environment? The thing to understand about these exams, and the question I often get is, okay, well, I'm a Windows Server on-prem person. How much cloud do I need to know? Is it all cloud? Is it all going to be just Azure? What you'll learn in this talk, when I'm talking about hybrid, is that this approach to thinking about hybrid is about taking what you've got and what you're using and how you extend that, how you improve that, how you enhance that, how you empower that by plugging in the appropriate cloud technologies. So let's imagine that you don't know what Windows Server is. And I'm guessing that most people, given that this is a Microsoft event, actually have a fairly basic understanding of what's going on here. But for those of you who need a bit of remedial coverage, it's a general purpose server operating system used by some organizations for 25 plus years. It actually got started in the Windows NT 3 days, NT 3.51, which came out around 92 or 93, about the time that I actually started working professionally in IT, before Windows 95, before NT4, and certainly before Active Directory. Now, what a general purpose operating system does, or a general purpose server operating system does, is it provides all of those meat and potatoes roles to your environment. Because some people sit there and think, well, isn't computing just about applications that are available in the browser? Isn't computing just about the stuff, the apps I run on my phone and whatever back-end services need to support them? Well, it turns out that the most common type of server in the world is a file server. Why? Because most organizations in the world aren't really IT companies. They're accountancies, for example, who need to do people's tax returns and they need to store their Excel spreadsheets in a central location. There's also the print server. Sometimes there's an intranet server, and that intranet server just has to host a bunch of web pages that help people do their jobs. And for the most part, most organizations don't even have anybody involved in information technology on staff. What they've got is that they've got a couple of servers. They use Windows Server because it hosts Active Directory, and they log on to that and they access their file shares, and maybe they access their intranet server. And as a general purpose operating system, it's got a DHCP server, and it's got a DNS server, and it's got a whole lot of other things. Now, of course, you can do that all with Linux. However, there's a unified approach to Windows Server, and certainly in the 90s and early 2000s, there was a lot of people that came in and said, we just need something that we can go and put in, and it's easy to manage because it's got a very easy to understand interface. And Windows Server fits the bill, and that's why there are literally tens of millions of Microsoft customers all over the world that have Windows Server deployed. And as I said, provides identity storage, networking, application hosting, virtualization, and management roles. And there are organizations all over the world that are still hosting on-prem Exchange, SQL Server, SharePoint, and other common workloads. And as I said, the file server is the most common type of server in the world. Now, what about hybrid cloud? So understand it this way. Rather than a cloud-first approach, where you're starting a business and you think, where do I go? And do I go out and buy some servers, or do I spin them up in the cloud? Most organizations have an existing infrastructure. So on-premises servers or on-premises services can be extended into the cloud, but you can also take management tools that run in the cloud and use them to manage resources on-prem. So hybrid is bidirectional. It works that you can take stuff and push it into the cloud, and then you can do stuff from the cloud and push it back on-prem. Roles, applications, and services in a pure hybrid environment are located in the best place for your organization. And a great example of that is probably Exchange. If you went back 20 years ago, everybody was running Exchange on premises. But Exchange by its nature, because it deals with email, is something that is almost natively something that you want to have, certainly with internet connectivity. So that is why it's one of those things that when Exchange Online and Office 365 and M365 became available, a lot of organizations said, you know what? It does make sense for all of this to exist in the cloud, and probably less sense for our organization, unless we have very specific requirements around compliance to keep them on-prem. So some of those things moved up to the cloud, whereas there's other things, and file services is a good example. If you're working in video production, or if you're dealing with very large files, you want to have those files very close to where you're working with them, very high bandwidth connection to where you're working with them. If you're moving a couple of gigabytes around the network, you want to be doing it over a very fast network, and that's very difficult to do if those files are sitting in the cloud, because we just don't have that level of internet speed between most people's on-prem workstations and cloud data centers. So let's talk about several aspects of hybrid technology. The first one I want to talk about is Windows Server Hybrid Administration. And when I'm talking about all of these beginning elements of Windows Server Hybrid, you'll see a reference down the bottom of the slide in red to the objective domain within the Hybrid Administrator Associate exam that actually links to the topic I'm covering. I'm not covering all of the exams. All I'm saying is that even from a beginner perspective, you can understand how these technologies fit into this Windows Server Hybrid beginning story. So, hybrid administration. A good Windows Server Hybrid Administration idea is to have the same set of tools managing your on-premises and your cloud resources. And we've got Windows Admin Center, which has been shipping for the last few years as a good tool that you can use to do that. Windows Admin Center is a web-based console that you can use to manage your on-premises Windows Server resources, but also allows you to connect those on-premises resources to Azure. And several of the services that we're looking at in this talk actually are managed through Windows Admin Center. But if you've got Windows Server running in the cloud, you can also use an on-premises instance of Windows Admin Center to actually manage those servers that are running in an Azure data center. But it's not just from the ground up. Azure Arc is a technology that has been talked about many, many times at Ignite. And Azure Arc is a suite of technologies that allows you to use the cloud as your management plane, that you connect into the cloud and then you use the cloud to manage your on-premises endpoints or your endpoints in other people's clouds. So that rather than you sitting on-prem and saying, I'm going to be managing up, with Azure Arc, you're almost managing down. So in terms of hybrid administration, in terms of the basic hybrid administration, understand that you find the management system that works for your organizations. For some organizations, the top-down approach is going to be absolutely perfect. For other organizations, their deployment is going to be such where they're going to mostly do their administration of their cloud resources through their on-premises resources because their cloud is a back-end to on-prem. Windows Server Hybrid Identity. Identity is one of the most important parts of any hybrid story. Simply put, what you want to do is you want to have the same user account being able to use to access resources, be those resources running on premises or in the cloud. In fact, if you go back, and most of you won't be as old as some of us are, in the 1990s, we used to have on our networks that every resource that you accessed, you needed to have a separate set of identities for. I started IT support at the University of Melbourne, and I remember when I was walking around the corridors there, I would walk into people's offices and they would have post-it notes on the side of their monitor with their login and password for each separate university system that they needed to access. And each one of those had its own password policies, and each one of those you had a different username for. When we moved towards using Windows NT as our identity provider, suddenly all of those identities could be collapsed and you could use a single identity. So with hybrid identity, what you can do using a product called Azure Active Directory Connect is that you can take your on-premises identity and replicate it up to the cloud. If your organization has Microsoft 365 or Office 365, you're already doing that. You're signing into the cloud with the same identity that you use to sign into your local computer. So understand that Azure AD Connect can replicate on-premises Active Directory identities into Azure so that you're using a single identity. Whereas when we got started with the cloud, when you were logging in to a cloud resource, you needed a separate account to access all your cloud resources compared to all of your on-prem resources. Now, in terms of Windows Server, you might be thinking, okay, I want to run some Windows servers in the cloud. How do I connect them so that I can use the same identity to sign into those Windows servers in the cloud that I use on-prem? And you use hybrid identity to solve that particular problem. Hybrid security is the idea that if you're going to think about security, you can't have separate stories for your on-premises resources and your cloud resources. That what you need to have is that you will need to approach the security of your resources from a hybrid perspective. That means that you've got to look at the security of all of your cloud resources and all of your on-premises resources. Because with security, it always comes down to this idea that the weakest link in the chain is the one that's going to break. And if you've got terrible cloud security, but great on-prem security, it's not going to matter because an attack is going to go after the weakest link. So with Azure Security Center, you can get visibility into the security configuration of your cloud resources, but you can also see the security configuration of your on-premises resources so that you can tell if your on-premises Windows Server instances are not configured as well as they could be in terms of security, that maybe they don't have anti-malware software installed, that maybe they don't have their hard disks encrypted. The same applies to your resources in the cloud. So in a hybrid approach, you're using one tool to monitor or to assess the security configuration and raise alerts, which is the second part of this slide. We have a product called Azure Sentinel. Azure Sentinel is a SIEM. A SIEM is basically a big collector of security event information. So what you want to do is, traditionally, you would have a SIEM sitting on-prem, and it would connect to all of your security information from all of your servers and all of your network infrastructure and all put it in one place. Well, with Sentinel, you can go and put that in the cloud and then have all of that on-premises telemetry going up to the cloud, as well as ingesting all of the telemetry from all of your cloud resources in the same place. So that again, when you're analyzing, when you're searching through the security telemetry for your organization, you are seeing all of the continuum. You're seeing all of that spread from on-prem through to the cloud, and you're understanding your security in that particular manner. Microsoft Defender for Identity. So with your on-premises Windows Server instance, the thing that any attacker is going after is that they're going after Active Directory. Because if you can attack and successfully compromise Active Directory, you have control over identity. And if you've got control over identity, you've got control over everything. Now, what Microsoft Defender for Identity does is it uses the power of cloud analytics to look at all of the telemetry specific to Active Directory on-prem, and then to notify you of whether or not there's suspicious activity. Because if someone's attacking your Active Directory, often they're not doing something very brute force, they're trying something subtle. And the cloud and the power of analytics that is available within the cloud allows you to really touch on and examine the problems with that telemetry, and then to tease out whether or not someone is actually attempting an attack. So what it does is it constantly updates its heuristics. And this is also important. If you think about how anti-malware software works, or it used to work in the past, it used to look for virus signatures. That is, it was trying to identify a file that was clearly infected by the binary characteristics of that file. Behavior-based security is looking for activity that indicates that it's problematic. And it might be, you know, a bit different. It's sort of like in Dune that you walk without rhythm so that you don't attract the worm. But behavior-based security allows you to even detect whether or not a set of footsteps on the sand are, you know, someone walking through the desert, or it's just the wind pushing on the sand. Sorry, that was a bit too nerdy for this reference, but you want to have the power to have your heuristics constantly updated so that as new and novel attacks develop, you're able to detect them as they're known about, rather than when you update your security product with the latest set of definitions. Windows Server hybrid file services, to me, are the most obvious early step into the cloud beyond, say, Office 365. Anybody who has managed a file server, and I did say that file servers were the most common form of workload, knows that you hit a problem fairly quickly. That is that people are always creating brand new files, but leaving the old ones in place. Why? Well, why would you remove them? Because you go and put the files on the file server. And there was a study done that found that if data hasn't been touched for 90 days, that if there's a file that's been put on a file server and it hasn't been opened for 90 days, there's a 95% chance that that file will never be opened again. However, no one is sitting there and counting when those 90 days have occurred. And one of my first jobs as a server administrator was going into a file share that was running out of space and trying to figure out what to remove. So what I'd do is I'd back up a whole lot of files that looked like they were in folders that were older folders to tape, and I'd go and put those tapes in a cupboard and then hope no one would ask about those files. Of course, someone would come back and say, hey, there was a file in this folder and I can't find it anymore. And then I would have to go and find the right tape and bring it back. What Windows Azure File Share does is it basically plugs into your existing file server infrastructure and turns on what's called storage tiering, which basically does is it looks at the age of a file, and if the file's older than a certain number of days, what it does is it puts a placeholder there like you get in OneDrive, and it keeps a copy of that, full copy of that file in the cloud, but it takes it away from that on-premises location. But for the purposes of whoever's looking at that file, when they're navigating, it looks like it's there. And if they try to open it, it replicates down from the cloud. But what it means is that your file server is continually being cleaned up and you don't have to do it manually. In terms of hybrid networking, in terms of how you connect your on-premises network to the cloud, the most obvious one is a virtual private network. You can set up a virtual private network so that you've got an encrypted connection between on-premises and the cloud. You can also use VPNs or a thing called ExpressRoute, which is a dedicated connection. And then if your organization is more and more integrated with Azure, instead of you configuring a wider area network with a hub and spoke topology where you're managing the hubs and spokes, you can basically treat every on-prem location as a spoke, and you can treat Azure as your hub through Azure Virtual WAN. Software updates is something else that you need to think about in terms of hybrid environments. So essentially, you need to make sure that all of your on-premises resources are updated. And you might have done that in the past using Windows Server Update Services or System Center Configuration Manager or another third-party product. But you also need to make sure that all of your resources in the cloud are being updated as well. Remember that wherever the weak link is, that's where the attack is going to go. So with Windows Azure Software Update Management, you can actually make sure that all of your on-prem and your cloud server instances are kept up to date. Backup and recovery is something also that works very well in hybrid environment. In the past, you used to back things up on-prem and you used to back them up to a tape drive. Then you would take the tape drive and take it off-site in case the building burnt down, that way that you could recover your infrastructure. What we've got with Azure Backup is we've got the ability to take your backup on-prem and then use your tape library becomes all of that infinite storage that's sitting in the cloud. So it's a case of taking what you've got on-prem and then backing it up to the cloud. And similarly, you should make sure that all of your resources in the cloud are being properly backed up. Disaster recovery is probably the last thing I want to cover in this intro to Windows Server hybrid talk. Now, there are other elements of hybrid, but I wanted to cover these main aspects specifically and how they map through. And you can see this one maps to the AZ801 exam, the Implement Disaster Recovery objective. The idea here is that in the past, you would have a disaster recovery site that might be located in a building on the other side of your city or in another state or whatever. And that periodically you would do a disaster recovery drill where you pretended that your primary site had something terrible happen to it, like a meteor strike or too many snakes or too many spiders, and that everything would need to be moved to the disaster recovery site. What we've got now with things such as Azure Site Recovery is that we have the ability to replicate all of your on-premises workloads up to the cloud continuously, so that in the event that something fails on-prem, you can turn on those virtual machines in the cloud. That until you turn them on, they're just sitting there in storage as basically full replica, cold replicas of the virtual machines, but that you can use a single button to turn them up on and run your disaster recovery site in the cloud. The benefit of doing that is that you run it in the cloud until you get your primary site fixed, and then if you want, you fail back. It's not we're using this as a way to migrate to the cloud and you can't come back. What you're doing is you're using the cloud as a site should you need to fail over to the cloud and operate purely as cloud only because a flood has come through and wiped out your business on-prem. When all of that's fixed, you can bring the stuff back. Okay, so in this talk, I talked briefly about the Admin Associate certification. We talked about Windows Server. We talked about hybrid cloud. We talked about Windows Server administration, hybrid identity, hybrid security, Defender for identity, hybrid file services, hybrid networking, software updates, backup and recovery, and disaster recovery. Remember, what is hybrid? Well, it's a continuum. Now, I might have time for one or two questions, but otherwise, it's at Oren Thomas on Twitter, and I'm very happy to answer any questions that you've got. Here's a set of resources. There's a Hybrids Getting Started guide. These slides will be available linked to the talk, and please fill out an evaluation. Are there any questions? Okay, well, thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your night.